The episode opens in a classroom where Harry Dunning, an elderly man, shares a haunting memory from his childhood Halloween. He recounts how his father tragically murdered his mother, sister, and brother. Jake Epping, the teacher, listens attentively and commends Harry for his courage in sharing such a painful story. Afterward, Harry asks Jake if he would write a letter of recommendation for his job promotion, to which Jake agrees without hesitation. After class, Jake heads to a diner where he meets the owner, Al Templeton. They chat casually, but their conversation is interrupted when Jake's ex-wife, Christy Epping, arrives to sign their divorce papers. To give them some space, Al retreats to the kitchen. As Christy finishes up, she compliments Jake on his writing and wishes him well before leaving. Once Christy is gone, Al emerges from the kitchen looking much older and coughing up blood. He then suddenly collapses on the floor, prompting Jake to take him home. There, Al reveals that he has cancer, which leaves Jake puzzled about how someone could deteriorate so quickly. Al promises to explain everything the following day. The next day after class, Jake visits Al's diner. Al takes him to the kitchen and asks him to enter a closet. When Jake steps into the closet, he is transported back to Maine in 1960. As he explores, an old man repeatedly warns him that he should not be there. Confused and frightened, Jake returns to the diner and questions Al about the closet being a time portal. Al prefers to call it a rabbit hole and explains that he wants Jake to use it to prevent the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Al believes that stopping Kennedy's murder could alter the course of history and prevent the Vietnam War, though Jake is doubtful about changing the past. Al then gives Jake a pocket knife and asks him to carve JFK into a tree outside the diner in the past. Jake does as instructed and returns to the present. Al then shows him the tree outside the diner, where the carving from the past is still visible, confirming that the past has indeed been altered. Al then explains that if Jake travels back through the closet, everything done in the past will be erased and reset. He also clarifies that every trip sends him to the same moment, October 21st, 1960 at 11:58. No matter how long Jake stays there, only 2 minutes will pass in the present. Unsure about this time travel theory, Jake decides to take a break and attend his class graduation ceremony. Afterward, he returns to Al's place. At Al's house, Al takes Jake to a room filled with information about the assassination. According to public records, Lee Harvey Oswald is the main suspect in Kennedy's death. Al has studied Oswald and admits he saw him before the assassination, but was not sure if Oswald was the killer, so he did not intervene. Al also mentions another key figure, Walker, who was assassinated 6 months before Kennedy. He asks Jake to go back in time to check if Oswald was involved in Walker's shooting. If so, Al wants Jake to kill Oswald to change history. Al gives Jake some essential documents to help him blend in and survive in the past. Jake remains hesitant and says he needs more time to think. This leads to a heated argument, and Al ultimately tells Jake to leave his house. The next morning, Jake finds Al collapsed in his chair, unconscious. Concerned, Jake decides to travel back in time. He takes the keys to the diner and steps into the closet. When he arrives in the past, the same old man with a yellow card on his hat warns him again that he should not be there. Jake dismisses the warning, remembering Al's advice that the old man is not important. Jake then finds some period-appropriate clothing to blend in with the locals. While exploring, he visits a diner and comes across a young Alice, one of his present-day colleagues, who has different aspirations for her future. Jake then heads to a bar and awkwardly tries his hand at sports gambling. When he places a $100 bet on long odds for a boxing match, the entire bar goes quiet. The situation worsens when Jake's unlikely bet actually wins. To make matters worse, Jake's dubious betting partners trace him to a nearby motel. Fortunately, Jake manages to escape by using videos from his phone, something people in the 1960s are unfamiliar with. As Jake flees from the motel, he spots the man with the yellow card on his hat, standing mysteriously in the middle of the road, watching him intently. The next morning, Jake decides to throw his phone into a river after looking at photos of his ex-wife, Christy. While traveling, Jake encounters various old-fashioned elements in the present world, such as racially segregated bathrooms. During a stop at the Texas School Book Depository for his investigation, Jake meets a woman named Sadie Clayton. They bond over their mutual love of books, but Jake soon discovers that she is married. Jake then goes to the place Al had recommended for him to stay. He begins reviewing the documents Al had given him and reflects on Al's advice. He recalls Al's warnings about feeling isolated from others and the importance of keeping his distance, along with other guidance he had provided. Later that night, Jake heads to a telephone booth to try calling his father in Chicago, but is met with only a loud screeching noise. Frustrated, he hangs up and leaves the booth, but decides to give it another try. As he is about to enter the booth again, a car crashes into the booth. Jake rushes to the scene and finds a woman inside the car, covered in blood and apparently dead. As he kneels beside her, she suddenly opens her eyes and tells him that he should not be there. Jake then moves on to the next task Al assigned him, tracking George de Mohrenschildt, a close associate of Oswald, to find out if he was Oswald's CIA handler. His pursuit leads him to a Kennedy campaign rally. Jake manages to slip past security, but soon encounters a message that he should not be there. When he tries to escape the guards, he ends up in a room lit by red siren lights and swarming with cockroaches. Although he manages to flee, he is quickly caught by Kennedy's security team. Using his charm, Jake talks his way past his captors and follows George to a prominent Dallas restaurant. Al had told him that this dinner was significant, suspecting it was the night George was first contacted by the CIA, marking the beginning of a complex plot that would eventually involve Oswald. During his investigation, Jake faces resistance from the past. He avoids a violent altercation outside and a fire inside, but has to deal with a collapsing ceiling and a noisy bartender. Despite these challenges, he discovers that the men meeting George are indeed CIA agents. When Jake returns to his lodgings, he finds the place in flames with all his papers destroyed. With his other mission destroyed, Jake decides on altering one small historical tragedy. He then travels to Humboldt, Kentucky, with the goal of saving young Harry from his future homicidal father. In the next scene, young Harry is seen being harassed by some kids in the forest who throw his pants into the river. Harry then runs to a store where the owner keeps an emergency pair of shorts, since the bullies keep taking his clothes. Jake, who is sitting in the same store and watching Harry, later asks the store owner to help him find a place to stay. The store owner suggests a nearby lodging, and Jake heads there. After a brief introduction to the house rules, the lady who runs the place gives Jake a room. With his documents lost in the fire, Jake shifts his focus to Harry's situation. Remembering Harry's account of his father's violent behavior when drunk, Jake decides to visit a bar in hopes of finding Frank Dunning, Harry's father. Jake asks the man at the house about a local bar, and the man recommends that he visit Sammy's townhouse on the highway. When Jake arrives at Sammy's townhouse, he immediately asks the bartender, a young man named Bill, about Frank Dunning. Jake gives a vague reason, saying he was instructed to find Frank if he ever passed through Holden. Bill appears uncomfortable and inquires about Jake's identity. After Jake introduces himself, Bill suggests he sit and wait. Jake settles at a table with his beer just as a group of men come in and start causing a commotion. Before long, Frank emerges from the shadows at the request of his friends. Bill introduces Jake to Frank, who then joins him at the table along with his companions, Calvin and Dickie. After a long conversation and learning that Jake is a writer, Frank offers him an intriguing chapter for his book and takes him on a car ride. In the car, Frank questions Jake's story, which Jake describes as a ghost story. When Frank asks for the title, Jake replies, Halloween Town, provoking laughter from Frank. Frank then takes Jake to an empty slaughterhouse, where he bribes the night guard with a few cigarettes. He explains that his family has been in the meat business for generations. His grandfather was a traveling butcher, and his father worked in the slaughterhouse. Frank shows Jake the kill floor, where the actual slaughtering occurs. He reveals that his father was nicknamed the Bambino because he could kill a cow with a single swing of a hammer. Frank challenges Jake to kill a cow with a single swing of the hammer. When Jake hesitates, Frank suggests he think about his ex-wife to gather the courage. Despite the challenge, Jake chooses not to slaughter the cow, so Frank steps in and handles it himself. The next morning, Jake visits Frank's home and meets his wife, Doris Dunning. He pretends to be bringing good news, telling her they have won an all-expenses-paid Halloween vacation. Back at the house Jake is staying at, Jake strikes up a conversation with Mr. Price, the owner, about his military service. Mrs. Price proudly talks about her husband's achievements, including a Bronze Star, but Mr. Price dismisses the praise. He asks Jake if he served in the military. Jake lies, saying he served in Korea in a MASH unit. Mr. Price then shares his perspective, saying that there is no such thing as a true war hero. He recounts how, during a difficult situation in Sicily, he brutally drowned a young Nazi soldier, rather than simply bypassing him. Later, he was awarded the Bronze Star for his actions. Just then, Frank arrives and takes Jake to his butcher shop. Frank warns Jake about the consequences of breaking rules. Agreeing with Frank, Jake is stunned when Frank reveals Doris from the back room. Frank confesses that Jake was trying to seduce his wife. Frank then attacks Jake and throws him and Doris out of the shop. Jake tries to apologize to Doris, but she leaves without acknowledging his apology. As Jake heads back to Mr. Price's house, he decides to buy a gun and walks into the shop just as it's about to close. The shop owner initially jokes about not selling him a gun, but eventually gives in and hands one over. Later at Mr. Price's place, Jake recalls Al's stories about trying to help a little girl avoid a hunting accident, with complications arising at every turn. Al also shares that he is dealing with cancer as a result of his time travel, even though his past medical checkups did not indicate any issues. Jake, feeling unwell himself, does not let his illness obstruct him from his plan. Jake quickly stops by the pharmacy to get the medicine and then prepares to save Harry and his family. Armed with the gun he bought earlier, he takes up a position outside Harry's front door, keeping a close watch. While waiting, Bill approaches him from behind with a knife. Jake tries to warn Bill that Frank is about to kill Doris, but Bill does not believe him until Jake reveals he is from the future. Bill then shares that Frank was once married to his sister, whom Frank killed along with her baby and buried them somewhere. As they argue, Frank sneaks into the house through the back door. Jake rushes inside, finds young Harry, and tells him to stay in his room. He heads to his parents' bedroom and shoots Frank in the shoulder to stop him from attacking Doris, but the shot merely weakens Frank. Frank knocks the gun away and swings a hammer at Jake, who narrowly avoids it. As Frank wrestles Jake to the ground, he urges Doris to run. Frank demands that Harry bring him the hammer, but Harry escapes downstairs with it. Frank tries to follow, but Jake intervenes and chokes Frank until he is dead. Jake then goes to Mr. Price's house. Mrs. Price meets him at the gate and asks if she should call the sheriff. Jake reassures her that, regardless of how it appears, he has not done anything wrong. Before entering the house, Mrs. Price tells Jake that only God knows what's truly in his heart, and he will be the final judge. She warns him to be prepared for that judgment. Jake drives away and makes a quick stop at a street-side faucet to wash the blood from his hands, reminding himself that Harry's family is safe. Suddenly, Bill appears from behind, holding Jake at gunpoint and showing him newspaper clippings about the Kennedy assassination. Bill orders Jake to get into the car with him, and they drive off together.